to be here. The first Seminole War happened up in the Panhandle of Florida. The commander, anybody know the commander of that war? The general? Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson came down. He did not have a mandate to invade Florida, but he decided he was going to do it anyway. And he came on down here and basically tried to wipe out all the Indians. He did not like Indians. Well, fast forward a few years, that was the first Seminole War. Fast forward a few years to what became known as the Second Seminole War. Andrew Jackson is now the president. He still has not developed an affection for the Indians. He doesn't like them and just wants to get rid of all of them. So he directs the Army to do that. Now it started with provocation. They would come down and build forts down in Florida, which the Indians considered this was their territory. They didn't want forts down here. So they come down and built forts in this territory. And a lot of people don't realize that when you think of slavery, you think of the Civil War. Civil War was a battle over slavery, North versus the South, and all of that. Seminole Indian War was also about slavery, but it was a completely different war in that the Army, the U.S. Army, became the helpers of the slave catchers. Slaves would run away from Georgia and South Carolina and run down into Florida, and the Indians would take them in and harbor them. They became allies of the Indians. In some of the battles of the Second Seminole War, as many as half of the Seminoles were black Seminoles who were runaway slaves. Well, the slave owners, slaves were very valuable, and they would send slave catchers to retrieve their slaves. They would come into Florida and go into the Seminole villages and start gathering up the slaves, and the Seminoles go, no, those aren't slaves, those are our people. Don't bother them. If they persisted, they ended up dead. And so after a few of the slave catchers didn't come back, or they went back with stories of how they weren't allowed to retrieve the slaves, the slave owners complained to the government, and Andrew Jackson sent the Army down here to help gather the slaves and send them back. Well, that's what it started out being, but the Indians didn't respond well to that. At this particular fort, there was a threat in December of 1835. Seminoles started gathering in the woods around the fort, and they realized there was a problem, that they were getting ready to attack the fort. The Indian agent for all of Florida was named Wiley Thompson. He lived here at Fort King. The Indians did not like him, especially Osceola, because he had asked Osceola to come in for a parley, and then when he came in, he grabbed him, slapped him in chains, and threw him in jail, threw him in a prison. Well, infuriated Osceola, so he hated Wiley Thompson. The way he got out of it, he told him that he would go back. He said, "You've got to let me go. I'll go back and I'll gather up my people and bring them in," because by that time they wanted to export all not only the runaway slaves, but all of the Indians. They wanted to send them all out west to territories out there, primarily in Arkansas and what is now Oklahoma. At that time was just known as Indian Territory. They were going to send all the Eastern Indians out there, so they didn't have to, the settlers didn't have to deal with them. Well, when Wiley Thompson had captured Osceola, he told him he wanted to bring his tribe in. They were going to march them down to Fort Brooke in Tampa, load them on ships in Tampa Bay, and ship them out to the Port of New Orleans, and from there they would transport them to the Indian territories. Indians didn't think that was a great idea, but when Osceola left, he did in fact keep his word. He went and got his warriors. but he did not come back to surrender. Okay, he came back, and in about an hour and a half, you're going to get to see the results of when he came back. But that same day, the same day that there was an attack on the Indian agent at Fort King, there was a contingent of 108 troops marching from Fort Brooke down in Tampa. They were marching this way to reinforce this fort because all the Indians were starting to gather up outside, and they knew that they couldn't hold this fort with the troops they had. So they were sending an extra 108 troops. They got as far as what is now Bushnell. They were ambushed by a party of over 200 Seminoles, and of the 108, 106 died. 2 got away, but that's known as Dade's Massacre to the white people. That's what we refer to as Dade's Massacre. They reenact that battle the first weekend in January. If you've never been, it's a real interesting show. There will be 50 or 60 soldiers. There'll be 50 or 60 Indians, and a lot of the Indians are on horseback, riding, shooting. They'll be shooting the old muskets and rifles from the time that were black powder. Tremendous amount of smoke, noise, yelling, whooping, hollering, and all us guys getting to play Army. Like being a kid again.
Where, here?
It's in Bushnell. It's in Bushnell. It's January 6th and 7th this year. And it's a 2-day event, but it's the same exact event both days. So you go one day or the other. And we all get killed both days. So I die twice a year. I'm never one of the guys who gets away. But I want to tell you a little bit about the weapon that we used and the way that we fought back then. This is, people say, oh, you have a rifle. You have a rifle. No, it's not a rifle. It's a musket. Difference being, a rifle has spiral grooves in the barrel that causes the bullet to spin as it comes out, which causes the bullet to go straight. It extends the range and extends the accuracy. Indians had the rifles. The American troops had muskets. The muskets are smooth bore. You drop a bullet down and pack it in on top of some powder and fire it. And it just kind of works its way out the barrel, kind of flopping around. Maybe you'll hit something, maybe you won't. But they don't depend on extreme marksmanship. What they depend on is weight of fire. If you line up 10 guys side by side and say, ready, aim, fire, that's not just for drama. You want 10 shots going because then maybe one of them will hit something. Okay, that's what that was about. Now, the Army in Florida, because the Indians were really cheaters, they would hide behind bushes. They didn't just march in straight lines, carrying their guns and waving flags, and then everybody stop and shoot. They wouldn't play fair, so they would hide in the palmettos and behind the trees and ride their horses around, hoop and holler and scare us. So we developed a round called buck and ball. This has 3 buckshot, followed by a 65 caliber round ball. The rest is powder. Now, the process of loading this is a 69 caliber musket, but a 65 caliber ball. The reason for that is you want it to load. You want it to load very easily. You want to be able to drop that bullet in and have it fall down. That means you can fire much faster because you're depending on weight of fire. You're not hoping for marksmanship. You're hoping for weight of fire. So the more bullets you can put through this, a well-trained musketeer in the Army could fire 3 shots per minute. Okay, 3 shots per minute. Well, buck and ball allows each shot to have 4 projectiles. So now we got 12 projectiles a minute going out. That's a lot better. This is a, I'm sorry? No. But you got 4 shots going, and they're kind of scattering like a shotgun. Now, this is a flintlock musket, so called because there's a piece of flint rock right here. And that piece of flint hits this piece of steel, which is known as the frizzen, knocks it forward, throws sparks down into a pan. We have primed that pan by putting powder from the cartridge, and these cartridges come preloaded. We didn't have to load these. There'd be a case of cartridges come in, and you fill your cartridge box, and then off you go. Now, you would tear off the end of the cartridge to pour the powder into the pan, which led to an interesting regulation in the 1835 Army, that in order to be in the Army, you must have at least 2 opposable teeth. Okay? One on the top, one on the bottom. They didn't have to line up. As long as you could crank your mouth around where they were opposable, you were good to go. My granny would have never made it. But you would tear the pigtail off, prime the pan with some powder, close the frizzen. Then you would come up, dump the rest of the powder down the barrel along with the paper, the ball, and the buckshot. You would withdraw your ramrod and pack it down in the barrel, replace the ramrod. Now you're ready for 1 shot. Okay? Tell you some things about this musket. This is called the lock. It's a flint lock. There are other types of locks. Previous to this, there was a wheel lock and a match lock, but this was a flint lock, and it was really the state of the art for 1835. Shortly after that, they developed percussion caps, but they had not come into widespread use in the Army. This is called the lock. This part of the gun is called the stock, and then this is the barrel. When you own all of something, you own it. Lock, stock, and barrel. That's where that expression comes from. Another thing, the way that when you pull this back, you might be able to see the spark when I pull this. Everybody see the pan? Could you see the spark there? That spark goes down into the pan where you've put the powder. It ignites that powder. Hopefully, and it doesn't always work. Sometimes you got to pull it back, close the frizzen, click it again. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3 clicks to get it to go. But there's a tiny hole at the back of the pan that allows some of that spark to go into the barrel where you've dumped the rest of your powder. And that's what causes it to shoot. Now, after 5 or 6 shots, black powder residue is very nasty, and it'll clog that hole. Okay, we carry a vent pick for poking in that hole and clearing that out. But if you haven't picked your vent, the powder in the pan will burn, and it flares in your face, no more than normal, but it flares, whoosh, no shot. That's known as a flash in the pan. And that's where that expression comes from. All noise, no shot. Okay? All flash, no shot. That's a flash in the pan. But there are several things that come from this weapon. Now, once you've fired your 1 shot, if the Indians were coming from here to the far side, you'd be very lucky to be able to pick out an individual target of a person and hit them. You know, if I could shoot through that door, that would be a pretty decent shot. But as far as hitting an individual down there, forget it. The Indians knew you got one shot. You take your shot, here they come running. And they can run like a deer. Okay, these guys are swift. They'll close on you very, very quickly. Now, you're going through the whole thing, withdraw another cartridge. This is open, tear off the end of your cartridge, pour the powder, close it, turn it up. I'm here to tell you, they'll be on you before you get all that done. You don't have time for that. That's why the Army would also give you one of these. It's called a bayonet. And it turns your musket into a spear, essentially. Okay, now you can hopefully hold them that far back. For those of you who saw, did you see the fighting demonstration a while ago? The Indians had learned that the bayonets, this is not sharp at all. That's not even close to being sharp. The only place it's sharp is on the tip, and that's because it's a stabbing weapon. Okay, there are bayonets made that are sharp like a knife. This is not one of them. And the Indians had learned that once you make a thrust, they can get this out of the way with their hand. They don't have to worry about getting cut. And then they've got a tomahawk in their other hand, and they hack your head open. And they were very efficient close quarter fighters. Very efficient. Usually at the museum where I do this, I usually fire the musket at this point, but we don't have a straw ground. And black powder spitting out of the end of this. And this whole thing could go up. But I'm here to answer any questions that you might have. You had your hand up first.
So how come the Indians had the